Hello, I'm Libby Znaimer, and thank you for joining us for this Zoomer TV special report, The War on Faith, Religious Persecution Around the World. Religious freedom is under attack in much of the globe, and over the last few years, that attack has been escalating at an alarming rate. Here's a look at religious persecution by the numbers. This is based on rigorous research completed in 2012 by the Pew Forum on Religion and Public Life. The report finds there is religious persecution in 160 countries, and that means fully 75% of the people in the world live under some type of religious restriction. Christians were harassed in 139 countries, Muslims in 121 countries, Jews, who comprise less than 1% of the global population, were harassed in 85 countries. So where is it the worst? The countries with the highest levels of government restrictions on religion are Egypt, Indonesia, the Maldives, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. Then there's the question of social hostilities and strife. The countries topping that list are Pakistan, India, Iraq, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Somalia. Well, to complete that scary picture, Hindus were harassed in 30 countries and Buddhists in 21. With me, I have writer and commentator Conrad Black, who has written extensively on this subject. On my left, His Eminence Cardinal Thomas Collins, Archbishop of Toronto, who will bring us the Catholic perspective. Rabbi Yossi Saperman is the senior rabbi at the Beth Torah congregation here in Toronto. Shabir Ali is president of the Islamic Information and Dawah Center, and he is also a host of the weekly TV program here on Vision TV, Let the Quran Speak. Pundit Rupnath Sharma is spiritual leader of the Ram Mandir Temple and vice president of the Ontario Multi-Faith Council. And documentary filmmaker Martin Himmel has been immersed in this subject for the last few years. He's the producer of both Jew Bashing, The New Anti-Semitism, and Persecuted Christians, both airing here on Vision TV. Cardinal Collins, let's start with you. What do you make of those numbers?
I think it's a very real problem which we find throughout the world, where people are being persecuted either directly. We have violent persecution in many different places, but also there's a kind of in a milder form or a different type of form, more subtle form. It's a suffering that I think I particularly notice because here in our city here, people are here from many different countries, and they bring the stories of their family members who are suffering.
That's right. Now, Conrad, we have both these problems. We have government restrictions and government favoritism of religion, and also the social element. Do you think one is worse than the other?
I think it would vary from place to place, but in your survey at the beginning, you didn't mention the category of states that oppress all religions, and of course the communist powers lead those,
Yes.
North Korea being, I believe, the most offensive. But approximately 10% of the population of China are practicing Christians, but they're very seriously discouraged, and 3/4 of those have to practice in their own homes. The factor that astounds me and disappoints me the most is that 100,000, tell me if you disagree, Your Eminence, but 100,000 Christians approximately every year are killed in the world for religious reasons, not in car accidents or something. And it receives a completely insufficient amount of attention, I think.
You are so absolutely right, and we're going to be focusing on persecution of Christians a little later on. Shabir, what do you make of this? You know, a lot of this goes on in the Middle East and in Asia and Africa.
That's one of the surprising things for me. Not surprising because I'm hearing about it here on the show, but surprising from the point of view of that my reading of the Quran leads me to believe that the Quran is a book about inclusivism. God has created a world in which there will be things that God likes and God does not like, things that Muslims like and things that Muslims do not like. But as God is tolerant of all things, Muslims too should be taught to be tolerant. And my reading of the Quran leads me to believe that the Quran embraces the plurality of religions. The Quran in the 5th chapter and the 48th verse actually speaks to this and says that it will be like this until we return to God, and He will inform us about the things about which we used to differ in this world.
Rabbi Yossi, is there anything there that surprises you?
What surprises me is the inability of religious institutions and groups to realize that only an immature religion can persecute others. And on the other hand, the persecution of religion is fundamentally an immature idea. I would like to differentiate, however, between ethnicity and religion. I think that that's a critical element here. But certainly as a Jew and as a rabbi, there's not a day that goes by where the history of oppression in all its manifestations isn't present in front of us.
You know, and while you're speaking about anti-Semitism, if we're talking about the numbers, the statistics on anti-Semitism are especially disturbing because incidents of violence and vandalism against Jews went up 30% in 1 year alone, 2012. Here's a clip from Martin's documentary, Jew Bashing.
If you look carefully, the Jews dominate the business world, including Pakistan. The Jews control the stock exchange. The Jews control the diamond industry. The Jews dominate oil reserves. The main players in the world's largest superpower, the USA, are the Jews. The key players in the American elections are Jews. Jews are very small in numbers, but have great influence.
What we should do is exterminate them. Their behavior over 2,000 years has shown that when you kick them out, they always end up being let back in, basically by the Christians, and they cause the same problems. Well, call me a racist, evil, Nazi hater, whatever. I want my kind of people to survive and prosper. People German descended, blue eyes, good solid people who built, nice towns like this. I want them to prosper. I don't want the Jews to prosper. They're attacking me. I'm fighting back.
Wow. That clip from Jew bashing is especially shocking because it comes from an American in Missouri. His name is Alex Linder, and he operates the Vanguard News Network, an anti-Semitic, white supremacist website. And even more shocking is the size of the internet following this guy has. Martin, you spent time with him.
Yes, I spent time with him. Alex Linder, there's a rating agency among the internet advertising groups called Alexa. And he's rated in the top 1% of websites worldwide, which you have to understand there are 600 million websites, 180 million of them are active, and he's in the top 1%. He's ranked about 150,000. And that just shows what kind of a following he has. And to get to Alex Linder was very difficult. And I'm a Jew. I had to pretend I was a Catholic, no offense. But I had to meet him, and it was quite shocking to hear someone say it's time to exterminate the Jews less than 75 years after Hitler.
And the internet, have you found an increase in anti-Semitism or problems through the internet, Rabbi?
Yes and no. On one hand, there's a lot more material, such as what Martin was referring to, easily available. On the other hand, the search engines have started to remove results that have been identified as egregiously anti-Semitic. So more material available, easier to get, but the general public, it seems, there's an effort to try to shield some of these really terrible things from them. But then again, anyone who wants to access it could do it now, and it's all there, sadly.
Okay, well, you know that it is still very unusual to hear that kind of viciously anti-Semitic remark from an American. We are unfortunately growing used to that type of rhetoric from government leaders in certain parts of the world. Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the president of Iran, is spreading what is one of the hallmarks of the new anti-Semitism, and that is Holocaust denial.
The very pretext for the creation of the Zionist regime is false. It's a lie based on an unprovable and mythical claim.
Well, again, we've been hearing that for a while. Rabbi, how dangerous is that?
Any allegation that wouldn't hold up in front of a jury of burning children should probably not be spoken by a world leader. And in this case, Ahmadinejad unwisely has simply passed off his canard, using his little bit of power to try to put something out, which resonates because people actually want the pretext of the founding of Israel to be based on lies and allegations. So it's entirely political, and it's incredibly dangerous because the conversation has shifted, and now it's become common thought that, in fact, Israel was founded only because of the so-called Holocaust. And it's a terrible tragedy that the true history of the Jewish people has been blackened by this kind of canard.
Actually, it goes much worse than that, because I personally heard the leaders of Hamas, which is the radical Islamic leadership of the Palestinians in Gaza, who say it wasn't the Holocaust was a hoax. The Jews actually the Zionists did the killings. They slaughtered the Jews in the camps. It's all a conspiracy to get healthy Jews to Palestine and weed out the sick ones. And that same thing I heard in Pakistan. And in countries like Egypt, when you go to a soccer game, now you have signs that go up, "One nation for a new Holocaust." So the Holocaust plays over and over and over in many different forms, from Jews committing conspiracies in the Holocaust, denying it, or let's have another one.
Does the church have a role in fighting that?
Well, I think that we always have to be attentive to this type of thing. It's just horrendous. When people, for one thing, are denying reality, that's obviously a horrible thing. And so I think that there's been a tremendous effort, I think, on the part of Christians to speak out about this, to try to make people be aware of this type of horrible thing. And I think we have to always be aware of history and the evil that has been done. So I think a society needs these, what we call in Catholic faith, a thing called subsidiarity. We need these groups within society that are not the government. It's not like the individual and the state. There are communities which provide a personal relationship with God and with one another. And I think very often atheistic or pagan or all kinds of groups that want the government to control everything will try to eliminate any such opposition. And they have tried and consistently do so.
Shabir, have you seen an increase in anti-Semitism or in Holocaust denials in your community?
In my community, much of what I experience as anti-Semitism is largely tied to the Palestinian conflict. People look at the oppression of the Palestinian people and their explanation for that, and that in part may explain the attitude of Holocaust denial that we've heard espoused and which we all find abominable. Some Muslims may tie their anti-Semitism to passages in the Quran or references to events in the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. But what we must understand is that the Quran was revealed in a historical context, and the Prophet Muhammad operated within that historical context. And in that context, Muslims were in conflicts with others. And so the Islamic representation of the other within that historical context is something now we, in a new context, have to come to grips with. We have to understand the situation and what the verses were saying about that situation, and not generalize and say, well, this applies to all Jewish people all of the time in every part of the world, because it cannot.
Okay, we're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll look at the most persecuted religious group in the world today, Christians.
Some 100 Christians have been sleeping in a forest in Pakistan after a member of their group was accused of violating the country's strict blasphemy laws. They're building a new church out of branches in the secluded area after fleeing their neighborhood out of fear. Their ordeal began recently when a Christian girl was accused by one of her neighbors of burning pages of the Quran.
Basically, some of it cigarettes, and some of it is a special machine, very hot metal, and they just burn the bag with it. 32 times. And this is what they do for innocent people just because their belief.
Well, that is from Martin's documentary, Persecuted Christians. Christianity is now the world's largest religion, but it is also the most persecuted. According to some numbers, 100 million Christians are not free to practice their faith. Conrad, you've described this as the gravest, most unreported atrocity in the world.
Yeah, I was really referring more to the numbers that are killed, but yes, I think it is. Now, in one sense, it's not surprising because, as you say, it is the largest religion. It's Your Eminence, I think 2.5 billion Christians, something of that sort.
2.5?
Yeah.
2.5 billion, around 35 to 40% of the people of the world. And so it is natural, I suppose, that they would be. But in largely Christian countries, it's not the practice to think of Christians as a minority, and certainly not as an oppressed minority. But that is, of course, the case. And in many countries, majority of countries, they are minorities, and they are often very shabbily treated.
I've seen it firsthand in many cases. In this documentary you put, we followed one of these refugees you've brought here from Baghdad. Raja Shar, we followed how she got here. We went to, she was wounded in a suicide bombing in Baghdad at Our Lady of Deliverance Church, and I went to that church with Reverend Ashafi. And it's just astounding what's going on there. I mean, this is a year after the attack, and the remnants of the suicide bombers is still on the walls. 40 people were blown up there. The police and the military stole cell phones and jewelry from the dead and wounded. And you basically can't walk freely in Baghdad and express your faith as a Christian. Your life is in your hands every moment.
But of course, the thing is, they're being killed, and they are fleeing, and we are seeking to help them, which is, of course, what we want to do. But at the same time, we are facilitating the elimination of Christianity from the Middle East and from its homeland, and we don't want to do that. We want to help the refugees, but we would rather they not be refugees. Well, they need to be in their homes safe, and they cannot be safe. And Syria and Jordan used to be safe places for the Christians, but once you get a civil war going, the weakest group is the one that is the most vulnerable. We think of the two Orthodox bishops who have just a few days before this were gathered here and been kidnapped. We think of the people who are suffering. We're trying to reach out to them, but of course, if we are completely successful in saving the refugees and bringing them to Canada, there goes Christianity in the Middle East, and that's, of course, that's not right.
Well, one of the interesting findings of that Pew report is that religious intolerance is way up in the countries that experienced the Arab Spring. Conrad, what do you make of that?
Well, I suppose that in most cases, the Arab Spring deposed military regimes that were in their authoritarianism somewhat atheistic, and therefore they were not overly concerned with religious matters, and they've been to some degree replaced by religious zealotry. But you know that you get this irony in the Arab world. The Constitution of Algeria provides that the government, the democratic system, is to be preserved by the army, which has caused the army on 2 occasions to intervene to prevent free elections from taking place because they would elect anti-democratic governments. It's a cultural question more than a direct sectarian one, I think. But these depictions we've seen in some of the clips that you played of people attributing terrible motives to Jews or Christians or others, these are caricatures, and they can be got rid of by serious efforts by authoritarian governments to educate people. But we haven't been getting them.
Ironically, if you look at history, during the Soviet era, the socialist, secular Soviet era, Egypt was run by Gamal Abdel Nasser. Christians got to the highest levels of government there. They were generals.
Christian president.
Right, and then in Syria under the Assads, though they are very brutal and committing war crimes, Christians felt safe there because the issue was not religion necessarily, it was nationalism, Syrian nationalism. The same with Saddam. Even though he was very brutal and he did oppress Shiites very badly, Christians felt safe in these countries. Now they're in this odd situation where these leaders have been deposed and they're identified with the reactionary regimes and they're under the target. And that's one of the reasons they're suffering in Iraq and Syria. And in Egypt, it's become an Islamic country. And while Muslims can be tolerant in many countries, in Egypt, they're very much second class.
We're just going to take a break right now, and coming up after we return, we're going to look at why this issue is getting so little attention and what is the church doing about it.
We are a free society. We have to use our freedom and our democracy. We have to speak up against the persecution. We have to speak up against the persecution of the minority, no matter what minority, no matter what religion.
Il dovere del conclave era di dare un vescovo a Roma. Sembra che i miei fratelli cardinali sono andati a prenderlo quasi alla fine del mondo, ma siamo qui.
Well, that was Pope Francis's first appearance on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica right after his election. He has inspired great hope with his promise to embrace the poorest, the weakest, the least important. But what will he do for the world's persecuted Christians? Cardinal Collins, what efforts are underway?
Well, he's only been a pope for a very short time, so I think we can't make too many judgments on exactly what his plans are. But I think that the Church has been very, very concerned about all of this. He expressed a grave concern when the Orthodox bishops were kidnapped. And obviously, we try to work. We have nuncios and people throughout these different countries who are trying to help people in their suffering. There's also groups such as the Catholic Near Eastern Welfare Association, of which I'm a member, which tries to help people in place, again, to give them help where they're there, when they're in their homelands. But of course, that's all destroyed when there's violence. And what do you do when people are being shot? What do you do when you don't have a government that is going to be able to protect, even if it wanted to protect the citizens and those who are being persecuted? It's a grave concern, and as it's not being mentioned. It's a thing, it's hidden, and this is outrageous. It's hidden, and people are suffering enormously.
It's buried in the media.
I am the co-owner of the UK Catholic Herald, British paper, and we faithfully take all these accounts of what is done to Christians, and not only Catholics, all over the world, and we publish them all the time. Not sensationally, but we publish them, and the British national press never takes them up, or almost never. And it is absolutely scandalous. Now, if you were asking why this happens, I think we have to make the distinction here between sectarian affiliation, whether nominal or not, and a secular society. The fact is the media are in the control almost everywhere in the West of people who, in the great majority, are not religiously minded. They're not, I wouldn't have thought, particularly hostile to any one religion or another, but they're not religiously minded and they just don't notice. And because the tradition in the West is of a Christian one or a Judeo-Christian one, and as a civilization we don't think of ourselves as minorities, we don't particularly notice when these things are done.
Is that the reason that nobody perceives it?
I think there's a much more stronger reason. It's almost a political correct dogma that permeates in media, especially in more liberal tones of media, and it goes like this. When you look at the Middle East, where there's tremendous problems with Christians, and also Shiites suffer, and Sunnis suffer, and Jews suffer, it is, first of all, a struggle for democracy. It's not a struggle of religions that have been unleashed because of the collapse of authoritarian regimes. It's just a struggle for democracy. To say that it's a religious fight somewhere is very politically incorrect. And secondly, of course, the whole problem really boils down to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. There's a lot of that too. So it's the combination of Palestine-Israel, and this is a fight for democracy. Don't confuse us with issues like religious struggles, rivalries, age-old hatreds. That's really clouding the situation. If you watch the BBC, you watch many other networks, it's all boiled down to this very simplistic equation, which doesn't make any sense at all.
No, but Martin, 100,000 Christians a year are murdered in over 100 different countries. And do you think it all comes back basically to people's views of the Palestine-Israeli conflict?
No, I think it also came to the issue of democracy. But listen, we don't have to look there. We can look at Nigeria. There are hundreds and thousands of Christians murdered every month.
It's Sudan.
And in Sudan, there's much bigger. It just doesn't fit into the paradigm. Africa almost doesn't exist in Western media.
But what does this say about our great Western free press? It doesn't fit into their paradigm. People are being killed all over the place.
That's right.
It doesn't fit into their paradigm.
There's no money in talking about how the non-underdog is being persecuted.
It's much worse than that. If you go to film festivals, I try to take persecuted Christians to film festivals. You can't get them into film festivals. Don't confuse us with this. It's an issue. If I brought a movie on Arab democracy making its voice, or this is really a fight because of this is really a problem because of the Palestinian-Israel fight, I'll get into a lot of film festivals. But this you can't get into film festivals because it's reactionary.
We need to be a little bit realistic here. The fact that one group of people are being persecuted should be condoned by anybody. Whether it's the Christians, they have the highest statistics today. And if you go back in history, you might find somebody else had higher statistics. The realities are that, okay, if you look at Canada in our context, the people who are most oppressed, nobody talks about them, our native people. And the native people across the world, all of the native people of all these indigenous peoples of all these countries where Christianity has gone and converted people, what happened to them? Where are their statistics? It's never been talked about. So the media might be unfair, and maybe they are. The question is, the media sells paper and makes money, and they're not talking about the subjects and not interested in making money. Mr. Conrad knows that very well. He's in the business. The fact of the matter is, why should I talk about something that's not going to bring in money in the coffer, but yet it is a valuable thing to be discussed. But we should not focus on those who are on the high end of the statistics today. We must look at everyone who were there at some time or the other and address all equally.
Look, I think the news value of the oppression of people is quite high. So in the sense you mean it does bring in money. And I think the native peoples are talked about. And in fairness, there were terrible things done in Latin America. But, Your Eminence, I believe the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, were essentially abolished for 50 years because they objected to it.
Well, there was a lot of reasons. There were a lot of reasons because of that, for the abolition of the Jesuits. But I don't think I'll bring it up with the current Pope. I don't think that would be.
Okay. On that note, we are going to take a break, but Muslims are also under attack. Sectarian Sunni-Shiite clashes are on the rise in the Middle East and in Asia. Muslim minorities are targeted by other groups.
This is a Muslim gold shop in Mektila, being looted by an angry mob. The police watch, hopelessly outnumbered, as the shop is torn apart. Muslim and Buddhist communities have lived in Mektila for generations, but times are changing and anti-Islamic sentiment is taking hold.
Well, you just saw video of a hardline Sunni suicide bomber blowing himself up in a Shia mosque in Syria. And not a week goes by without some Muslim-on-Muslim violence somewhere in the world. And Muslim minorities like the Rohingya of Burma or the Uyghurs in China are among the most persecuted people on earth. Shabir, do you distinguish which problem is worse, Muslims killing other Muslims or other people targeting them?
Well, it is, of course, terrible that anyone is committing this sort of violence on anyone else. Muslims tend to notice a lot when the Uyghurs in China are being persecuted and the Rohingya Muslims are being persecuted. And we should notice and do something about it and call on the world to help us with that. But it is also true that there is a lot of Muslim violence against other Muslims. And perhaps this is the greater share of violence of the two. And all of this stems from ignorance. When we think of the Rohingya situation, we know that Buddhist monks are generally characterized by their peaceful outlook on life. And it is surprising that sometimes they seem to be involved in some of this violence as well. So where does this come from? To me, it all goes back to education. People are in many countries, largely illiterate. They hold on to a few core religious ideas, and they feel threatened if they hear some contrary view. But educated people generally come to know of this variety of views through their wide readings, and they have some way of assimilating all of these views into an entire worldview within which their own particular take on things is one part. So we recognize that I believe one thing, and I know that other people believe other things, and I'm not threatened by the other beliefs because I've examined those and I've, in the end, drawn my own conclusion.
How do you fight the hate? It was when I was looking for that clip on the internet, Martin, the comments attached to it were unbelievable. They were saying, it was from other Muslims saying, you know, we should kill all those kafirs, which means unbelievers.
Well, it's not just a matter of education, unfortunately, because I personally encountered it. I interviewed two vice presidents in Iraq, the vice president who was Sunni and the vice president who was Shiite. When you interviewed the vice president who was Shiite, he said all the problems of the killings in Iraq is because of those Sunni radicals in Saudi Arabia who are being filtered into Iraq. When you go interview the Sunni vice president who's Sunni, he says all the problems in Iraq are those radical Shiites that are coming from Iran, coming in there and attacking the Sunnis. And the day after the last American soldier left, the Prime Minister of Iraq, Nouri al-Maliki, issued an arrest warrant to that Sunni vice president. He's a Shiite, the Prime Minister. The Sunni vice president, saying he's a terrorist, and the guy had to flee. And days later, there were more bombings in Baghdad that could rival what's going on in Syria. So what we have is education is not just the issue. Sometimes the educated use the ignorant by telling them they're the enemy, the Shiites the enemy, or the Sunnis the enemy, to further their cause. Politics and religious rivalry go hand in hand, unfortunately, in this case.
But of course, if the populace becomes better educated, they will not play into the hands of these politicians who are using them as pawns in their own battles.
That's true, but you know, in China, talking about Islam, I had some very interesting occurrences in China. I went to an area called Yinshuan, which is ethnic Chinese Muslims, and they were banned during Mao's Cultural Revolution from doing anything, but they couldn't even have any open mosques, nothing. But then they reassembled, and the imams there have to be communists. It's a little bit of an oxymoron, and they wear badges of the Chinese state. And then the Chinese use them in a very sophisticated way. They take Han imams from Yinshuan, who are ethnic Chinese, move them to the Uyghur area, which are not ethnic Chinese and are also Muslim, and they then pit them against each other. And then you have Muslims from who are ethnic Chinese fighting with Muslims who are Uyghur, and it becomes another sophisticated battle.
I think it's evident that religion, politics are so deeply merged that it's impossible to tell what is religion and what is simply convenience. I can't imagine, Shabir, that the thought that you are lumped in together with so many of these terrible people sits well with you. I know you a long time. It pains me, myself and my own community, to be lumped in with people I don't like. Not a day goes by where you must say to yourself, how do I identify myself as not one of those people?
It is not easy. This is a discussion that Muslims have to take a little further, because when terrible things happen, such as the Boston bombings recently and the plot that was alleged to have occurred in Toronto and Montreal to blow up via rail trains, then naturally many Muslims are reeling from this and saying, well, they are not us. But the problem is that we do not have a cutting line to say, well, this is radical Islam, and that's not my Islam. What's the other one? There's a Sunni Shia split, which is bad enough, and people go to violence over that, which is again terrible. And many Muslims are afraid that if we were to draw another cutting line between the radicals and the non-radicals, then that too can become the root of much more violence, where the radicals are fighting the non-radicals and the moderates are fighting the radicals, and then who is the moderate anymore if we're all fighting? So it is not an easy question. But I believe it still comes back to education. If the Muslim imams can take this as a serious matter, and the Friday sermons can change, instead of just talking about death and the afterlife, we should talk about the real history of Islam, how ideas emerged and developed, what causes radicalization, the radicalization of the youth, and how to stem this radicalization before it occurs. I think a much more discussion has to take place in this regard, so that we cannot just simply continue to say, well, they're not us, because in a way they are us. They're coming to our mosques, they're part of the same community, and then it is the one out of the 1,000 that goes out and does something bad that reflects on the whole community, the one rotten apple that spoils the whole barrel.
What did you think of this whole business that the RCMP came out with all the imams saying they're the ones who gave us the information, and did this in a very public way? What did you think of that?
I think this is both good and bad. It's good that on the one hand, it shows that Muslims are cooperating with the authorities, and this is a religious and civic and legal duty of Muslim, both imams and lay people, to cooperate and to stem these acts of violence before they occur. On the one hand, coming at this stage in the game, when we have not seen the evidence yet for the crimes that were alleged, one might wonder if this gives an air of authenticity to the whole thing, that perhaps is not based on much. In other words, if my own brother accuses me of something, then I start to look guilty, even if no evidence has been produced so far. So I believe we need to wait and see how things will play out in the courts. That's very important. But that's not to defend anyone or to excuse any acts of violence. I believe that whoever commits these acts of violence should be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. And it is a good thing that the RCMP has involved the imams, and it is even better still that it was an imam who tipped them off to this occurrence in the first place.
Conrad, you want to respond?
Taking us away from Canada to these places where most of the suppression takes place, I put it to all of you that the intersection between politics and religion to which you referred, Rabbi, is really because of the temptation that politicians have in chronically misgoverned countries to distract the masses who are misgoverned and oppressed with religious prejudice, which is part of a tradition, and it certainly can be easily fomented in places where there's a lot of redistributive injustice and poverty. And it is a relatively simple thing to distract masses of uneducated people with bogeymen. And even in more sophisticated places, there is a bit of this in the Arab-Israeli conflict. I mean, there is no rational reason to be so preoccupied with the existence of Israel. And it is essentially a method to distract the Arab masses in places where it have been chronically misgoverned. There is no reason for hundreds of millions of Muslim Arabs to be so upset about the existence of Israel. It's not a large country, and it's not an offensive country to them.
Yes, of course, it becomes now an excuse for all of the Malays in the Muslim world. The one single solution is, get rid of Israel, we'll all be fine.
We're going to have to hold it right there. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what we can do to end intolerance, and is the Canadian government on the right track?
We are in the minorities in India, and I mean, when it comes to the minority in every country, you will feel the persecution in the hands of the majority.
I'm also further delighted to be able to announce Canada's first ambassador of religious freedom. He is a scholar, a man of principle and deep convictions. Please welcome everybody, Dr. Andrew Bennett.
Obviously, the mandate of the office is to promote religious freedom, freedom of conscience, freedom of belief around the world. It's part of Canada's principled foreign policy. It's about values that Canadians believe strongly in: freedom, democracy, rule of law, and human rights.
Well, that was the announcement of Canada's brand new Office of Religious Freedom, which officially opened its doors in February of this year. According to the Pew Forum, Canada has one of the lowest levels of government restriction on religion. Not as low as Liechtenstein or Finland, but quite a bit lower than the United States, where the report says both legal restrictions and social hostilities increased significantly over the last few years. So are we on the right track with this new office, Conrad?
Yes, I think we are on the right track, and I rather like the look of him, but I don't know anything about him. I think an articulate young academic like that, talking about the things he did in that clip we saw, he could be quite a useful ambassador for this country, I think, and a representative one.
Well, is that the right idea for us to sort of export our values? I mean, I think
so.
Yeah.
I think Canada, after being some of the worst countries in the world where intolerance is at amazing levels, this is the Garden of Eden of the world. There's no doubt about it when it comes to religious tolerance. There's no better country in the world, certainly much better than the United States, which has a lot of militant religion views. Per capita, Canada takes in more Iraqi refugees, in particular Christians, from what's been going on, than the United States, who has a certain responsibility, especially after the whole war in Iraq, which unleashed, to some degree, hidden, repressed religious rivalries. So I think Canada is a great example to the world in this.
I think anything that will help we should do, and certainly I don't know how much power and influence Canada has on the world stage, but it has some. And I think sometimes simply publicizing this, what's going on, helps. But we're always going to deal with governments which are not going to listen. And of course, much of this is beyond the power of some of the governments. It's just often in chaotic places. But it helps. It's better than nothing. And if we do something, that's good.
I think it's important to know that in Canada, we have a unique situation. I've been fortunate to be part of many multi-faith groups. One of them is what is called the Multi-Faith Conversation, where Dr. Karen Hamilton is part of it. And she recently came back from a conference whereby we were given an award, the Canadian group, for multi-faith dialogue. And I thought we have a template for showing the rest of the world how we can coexist in a harmonious way. And Canada is definitely outstanding from that perspective. And I think we should share this with the rest of the world.
Libby, I think it is very important that we have this office, even if it is only symbolic, because when we meet with other countries and we see that we have an office for protecting religious freedom, then the obvious question that arises in the mind of the others is, do you have a similar office? Are you similarly concerned about religious freedom in your countries? So Canada here is setting a trend and opening a new stage of thought. And I believe this is very important, even if the office is only symbolic. So as it is, I believe it is a giant step forward.
Okay, we only have a little bit of time left. Cardinal, do you have any closing?
Well, I think that certainly this violent, gross persecution, all these horrible things, we can do what we can. Maybe we can't do a lot, but by shining light on that, it helps. And we help those who are there. It also helps us perhaps to recognize a much more subtle issue in our own country and in neighboring countries like the United States of a kind of a secularist attack on religion, which is not with bombs and things like that, but which is through policies of exclusion in the United States, certain government policies, and in our own life. We have to be attentive to that as well. So I think this helps. It helps a bit, and we have to be attentive, especially I think when we see in Canada people coming from so many other countries. We need to, by helping and welcoming them, maybe they might be able to help their families that still remain back there in some way. But if there's violence and if there's that type of mob violence, what can you do from a distance? That's our problem.
Okay, and a final thought?
Perhaps we should fund the combating of international religious intolerance by opening a new casino.
Perhaps not.
I just say, come on, people, smile on each other.
Okay, I think that is a good note to end things on, and I think that this has given us a lot to think about and to work towards in our communities. Thank you to our live audience and to our panel, Cardinal Thomas Collins, Conrad Black, Rabbi Yossi Saperman, Shabir Ali, Martin Himmel, and Pundit Roop Sharma. I'm Libby Znaimer. Thanks for watching.
They weren't supposed to sell it.